Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the New Zealand Initiative. Welcome to the launch of our first major report, New Zealand's Global Links. My name is Oliver Hartwig, and I'm the Executive Director of the initiative. It's a real great pleasure to welcome you all tonight. It's a massive turnout, which just shows how much interest there is in our research and in our first report. The first report we were going to do at the initiative was always going to be about New Zealand's openness to the world, New Zealand's openness to trade, to global capital flows, to foreign direct investment. And I approached Dr. Bryce Wilkinson, the author of this report, early on when I started at the initiative about a year ago. And it was actually a recommendation from our board to start with this report and to start with a document that was meant to be a one-stop shop for policymakers, for academics, trying to inject some sense into the debate on foreign direct investment in New Zealand, because we thought that there is a lot of emotion in the debate, but not enough figures are known. So the idea was really to compile a document bringing together all the relevant statistics, all the relevant data on capital flows in and out of New Zealand. So I approached Bryce Wilkinson and said, well, can you put that together? And he quoted me, of course, as Director of Capital Economics, and said, well, that's an easy task. It will probably take about 2 or 3 weeks.
That's right. That's
well, and here we are today, about a year later. And the reason is actually that it has actually become a massive task, because as we found out soon in the project, the data are not readily available. They are really spread all around the place, and you have to look in very different places to find answers to even your most basic questions. And this report, I should say, is not even trying to come away with some policy recommendations. We actually left that for a future report that's still to be written. For this report, we really just wanted to know the details, the facts, the data behind the discussions on foreign direct investment, behind discussions such as, will we become tenants in our own country? So this is a massive undertaking, and this is the result of it, and I can just recommend you have a look at the report. You can actually buy it tonight. We're offering it at a special discounted price of $20, so if you want to see it, if you want to buy it, see one of my colleagues after the event.
Signed copies.
Signed copies are 25. Many of you will know Bryce Wilkinson. He is, I would say, one of New Zealand's best economists with a long experience in the banking sector, in treasury, in academia, and he's currently running his economics consultancy, Capital Economics. But as of today, he's also joined the New Zealand Initiative on a more permanent basis as a senior fellow, so it's quite appropriate on this day to launch your first report. And we very much look forward to your presentation. It will take about 40 minutes to go through some of the details, but you will find the complete data set in here and actually on the website. And you will find all the links you need in order to update all the data, because as Bryce keeps telling me, you cannot just publish it. You have to wait for the next set of data to be released. So if you want to just update your report now and then, you will find all the links where you can do that yourself. But for now, I'll just hand over to Bryce, and we look forward to your presentation. And afterwards, we'll have time for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oliver, and thank you for coming, ladies and gentlemen. There's another auspicious thing about today, and it happens to be the day, a year from the day Oliver first started with the New Zealand Initiative, so it's a double launch in that sense. Oliver's already said that, you know, there's just an amazing amount of data available. Easily, Statistics New Zealand has been diligent beyond all belief in setting up surveys in the last 20 years, and is producing voluminous data quarterly now on all aspects of investments overseas and investments in New Zealand, and debt, equity, portfolio, direct investment, other investment, the maturity structure of the debt, almost everything you can think of. And that's why, accompanying this report here, being released today, there's a spreadsheet on the web which has got about 85 tables, hundreds of time series of data which you can do. And as Oliver has explained, this report, knowing that it gets out of date every quarter, there's a bit more information. People can update it for themselves. Now, I think, you know, as you get into the data, it is confusing. There's lots of it. There's lots of technical relationships. There's lots of anxiety and alarmist talk and public debate, and probably many of you are here today because you think you'd like to get your heads around it a bit better. You'd like to have a better appreciation, not only just of statistics, which are boring, but how they interrelate and how they fit into a historical context. And that's what this report does. It it sits on top of all these 85 pages of statistics, and it runs you through them, what they're saying a bit. It puts them into a historical context. I go back to the 1870s, and it also, at the end of it, which I put up at the front, aims to dispel some of the myths which have populated the public debate, partly, I think, as a result of not being a document around like this, which does explain all the interrelationships. So that's what the report sets out to do. And the starting point is where all economists start since Adam Smith. Openness to the rest of the world is a good thing. It brings problems, you know, openness to international travel brings transmission of disease and stuff, but it brings relationships and building and know-how and technology and friendship. It integrates people. Openness to capital markets allows New Zealanders to get well-diversified portfolio investments by going offshore. It allows firms wanting to borrow for capital projects to get access to the world's savings where there might be not enough New Zealand savings to go around. And it provides information and constraints on some of the nonsenses which can go on in a closed economy like North Korea, where the population doesn't have exposure and information about what's going on overseas and can't therefore discipline and evaluate what's happening on the home front. David Cagle, when he was Associate Minister of Finance and floated the exchange rate, commented that he thought it would be one of the most important things his government was doing to increase the accountability of New Zealand governments. But it's like marriage. When you marry someone, you get the good parts and you get the human parts. We've all got strengths and weaknesses, so exposure to the rest of the world gives you nasty shocks from time to time, like the quadrupling of oil prices in the mid-1970s and like the global financial crisis right now. So, but the important message from economists is that openness is much better for prosperity and the well-being of a people than closedness. Right. So why is openness so scary? Well, there's an organisation based in Christchurch, which I've actually quite come to like in the course of the study. It's the Campaign Against Foreign Control of Aotearoa. And they're diligent collectors of the data. And I've actually found that the data they collect and publish is pretty accurate. To their credit, they are conscientious about trying to get the data, in my experience and my reading, but they make this enormous leap from data to facts. So they work on the fear that foreign direct investment, which is investment in particular companies, which gives you ownership, control potential based on 10% ownership or more, is really going to mean loss of control. And they don't quite go as far as, say, let a McDonald's get established in New Zealand and before you know it, the Americans will be bombing you, but it does sort of have that connotation of it. The other great fear, and it's a distinct fear, and keep the two distinct and clear in your mind, is the fear of impoverishing debt. So this is sort of the idea, and think Iceland here, Ireland recently, Greece, and most recently of all Cyprus. This is the fear that you get so much debt that you can't sustain it and you lose sovereignty in one way or the other. That's a real fear about debt, and it's been a fear about debt since the Bogle borrowing era in New Zealand, and New Zealanders have always rightly kept quite a close eye on governments, not always successfully, but yeah, debt is something to take seriously. So those are the twin fears, and these are fears. Kafka Campaign Against Foreign Control of Aotearoa has on its website a list of key facts, and these are sort of what Thomas Sowell would call fear-generating facts or gee whiz facts, and those are the ones it has on its website, and I think the first three of them are probably factually accurate. The second one, create no new assets, I think that's an exaggeration. And the second one, and the last one, employ only 19% of the workforce. Well, that's quite a lot, you would have thought. Those those are the facts it started with, but it's not so much the facts, it's the disconnect between the emotions on their these are key facts on their key facts page as well. You see, they're not facts at all, but FDI means recolonisation, company by company. That's very, very emotive. FDI makes ordinary Kiwis involuntary competitors in the race to the bottom. Well, that's the opposite of the economist's conception of openness being good, not perfect, has problems, but not being good. So the first thing to do then was, part of this paper was going through these 85 pages of tables and hundreds of time series and trying to glean out some of the major facts. You're probably pretty familiar with these, most of you, from your reading, but this is just pulling them together. So NIIP, Net International Investment Position, that's the difference between what New Zealanders own overseas and what foreigners own in New Zealand. So that's negative by that's the debt, the 140 billion. Sorry, the NIIP, that's the top line I'm still on, is negative by 146 billion, which is 72% of GDP. And that's a big number. It's not unprecedented in New Zealand's history. It was bigger than that in the Vogel area, much bigger, and it was still bigger than that going into World War I. But it hasn't really been as large today as it was, as it is now, for many, many decades, well, the second half of the 20th century. Net debt, I said 146 billion for the net IIP. The debt component of that is 140 billion. And the gross debt is 252 billion. And that's a big number. Let me put that in perspective. The Statistics New Zealand's estimate of the total capital stock in New Zealand is about 500 billion. That's the value of all commercial buildings, all residential buildings, all plant and machinery in New Zealand. The unimproved value of land is not included in that 500 billion. It's about another 500 billion. So that's 1 trillion of assets in New Zealand. 252 billion is quite a big proportion of 1 trillion. So foreign direct, the investment in New Zealand is very significant in relation to total assets, and that's why the employment of foreign-owned companies in New Zealand is significant. The stock of inward... now the next point is an important one. 85% of that gross debt isn't silly old naive New Zealand households rushing out and borrowing from unsophisticated overseas lenders. It is actually borrowing of the banks, which are largely Australian owned, as you know, from their parent banks or from wholesale market purposes, who are sophisticated borrowers, lenders. So we've got sophisticated borrowers, being the banks, and sophisticated lenders, being the wholesale market and the parent banks, all monitoring what they're doing closely. The banks are monitoring themselves, the rating agencies are monitoring the banks, the regulators are monitoring the banks. It's a stable position in that it's persisted through a couple of decades through some rather awful financial shocks. So it's not a story of naivety here at all, and that's worth bearing in mind. The stock of inwards foreign direct investments, 48% of GDP. It's significant. You can go through mentally industries in New Zealand, ones which aren't government dominated, and think, well, yeah, there's some big foreign firms in our supermarkets and our banks and our insurance sector. You can go through, you can see why it's significant. But it's overwhelmingly sort of from friendly countries, countries we've got long relationships and trading partners with. Started out, of course, only being London in the 19th century, because that was about the only finance centre in the world, and that was the home country to the colonists. It wasn't really foreign borrowing at all. It's now heavily from Australia, 55%, and the US is next at about 12%, UK. Foreign-owned land, we think it's about hard to get good statistics on that. The Overseas Investment Office, and there are probably some people here today, collect data on transactions in it, but it doesn't tell us what the accumulated transactions are, you know, back through the course of time. We think maybe 1 million hectares seems to be a reasonable estimate, which is about 4% of the land area in New Zealand. To be a bit higher as a percentage of the usable land, But you can see from that there's no issue of New Zealanders running out of land to buy. And remember too that the figure's only as high as that because their foreign holdings of big estates like forestry estates, the ex-Carthold Harvey ones, and some of the major farming homesteads in the South Island, that sort of thing. And there's a section of the paper here where I try and calculate just what foreign ownership is as a percentage of that 1 trillion of assets in New Zealand, and I present 3 ways of doing the calculation depending on what you want on the numerator and the denominator, and that's where the 18 to 25% figures come from. So I've mentioned that historically we've been more indebted before. Well, 1886, the first chart where the private net indebtedness was 162% of GDP, and the public one was another 111%, so you had 273% at the height of the Vogel borrowing era. And remember, the figure today is about 70%. So the colonials really got into debt in a big way. By 1910, these figures are by a Victoria University of Wellington economist, Zig Frankel. The private was down to 60%, but government was still up at 91, so we're still talking 150% of GDP. 26%, despite World War I, and in between the two, it was down to about 100%. But 1949, look at that, it was down to just 15%. So the big question is, well, how did we get from 15% to 70%? And the answer is, when you look at the data, that we were doing quite okay until the mid-1970s when oil prices quadrupled. That meant that our import bill became massive relative to exports, and that year we ran a current account deficit of 13% of GDP. That lasted for a long time. Governments went into heavy borrowing for the same reasons as they are today, Keynesian reasons of sustaining domestic demand. The economy didn't get the chance to adjust much, so it just cruised along and we kept borrowing. Government started running deficits of 6% of GDP on the fiscal side. And the 1976 budget, Muldoon's first budget, was a big exception to that. But he really set out to pull down the deficit, but he reversed track, and by 1977-78 had the deficit back up at 6% of GDP again. So what we find is that on unofficial estimates by IMF researchers, and I'm grateful to the Reserve Bank for appraising me of this information, was that the net international investment position had jumped from virtually nothing as it was in 1949 to around 70% of GDP by 1986-87. And 70% then, of course, sounds very like the 72% today. It sounds like nothing much has happened. Actually, it's gone up and down quite a bit since then. But the important point is that the damage was essentially done by 86-87. A chart of the data. This has got 3 lines. The top series of lines there is the estimate of what is invested in New Zealand in debt and equity by foreigners. And we've got, because of the broken periods of unofficial data and semi-official data and then the latest data, we've got 3 estimates for each line. So the top line is showing that on the most official data, the Stats one, the liabilities are 150.2% of GDP in 2012. The middle line is what New Zealanders own overseas. And again, there are 3 lines because they're 3 different data sources of broken periods. And you can see that New Zealanders own overseas 78% of GDP. And the bottom line is the difference between the two. It's the headline figure which gets all the publicity. It's the net amount we owe overseas, and that is the 72% of GDP at the moment. So those data series, I don't have a great deal of confidence in the absolute accuracy of any of them, but I think they're telling a story that's consistent with each other broadly, and also consistent with what the balance of payment statistics are showing. And to amplify that last point, This is purely balance of payment statistics. It's the net income paid overseas, which is an important part of the current account deficit. In fact, it's the dominant component of the current account deficit these days. It's a rather noisy series, so I've put a smoothing curve through it. And on the smooth curve, you can see it was 1.7% of GDP in 1974, reflecting quite a low level of net external indebtedness at that time. You can see how sharply it climbed through that horror period of the borrow and hope to get on a smooth basis to 5% of GDP by 1987. And the smooth curve peaked at 6% in 1995. Now, there might be some comfort that it started coming down again there, but I'd urge not too much complacency about that, because interest rates are at a 50-year low worldwide. New Zealand's net external liability is nearly all debt, as I explained in that earlier slide. So you'd expect our net interest income paid overseas to be abnormally low at the moment, rather than abnormally high. So I don't offer much comfort on that. That's sort of the historical survey part of the report. Now I'm moving to the interrelationships part of it, the accounting interrelationships. And I put up 4 of them there. Now, I've got an equal sign, but they're all identities. If I were using proper mathematics, I'd use 3 horizontal lines to show, where are we? 3 horizontal lines. So the first one is the current account deficits, in the simple, the statisticians here will realise that I'm leaving out some smaller components, and in the case of the first one, it's net current transfers. Essentially, the current account deficit, abstracting from that, is the gap between imports and exports, so we have to watch that, and it's plus the net income paid overseas, which is the dominant component these days. But the current account deficit, because of the way savings are defined in the national income accounts, is also exactly the same thing as the gap between investment and savings. They're just 2 sides of the same coin. The change in the net international investment position is basically the current account deficit. It's the amount, when it is in deficit, that you have to borrow overseas to fund the imports you're buying in excess of exports and the deficiency on net investment income. So the bigger the current account deficit, the bigger your net external debt. But then once you've got, bankers in the room will know this, once you've got a large amount of debt, your ability to service it is going to depend upon the race between the rate at which the debt grows, which is proportional to the interest rate which it's accumulating on you in, if you remember your credit cards, and the rate at which you can grow your income, which is your ability to service it. So what is very important, if you've got a big debt, as New Zealand does, is to watch what you're doing to your rate of economic growth. Because if you can't do anything about the fact that you've already got this legacy of big debt. It's something in the past. It's something my generation's largely passed on to the generation of younger workers today. But by growing income, you can make that servicing more affordable. Growing income, of course, will tend to allow both consumption and savings grow. So what's the significance of those things? Well, it's come to the public debate and the myths on it. So the first proposition, and I cite an IMF report on New Zealand published in March 2013, so that's last month, and it points the figure entirely and solely at savings. It says, and I quote, "Reflecting low national savings relative to investment, New Zealand has run persistent current account deficits," correct, by definition, "resulting in net external liabilities which are high by international standards." Now that's a statement about causation, resulting in net external liabilities. The deficit is expected to widen this year, correct, despite relatively strong terms of trade as earthquake-related reconstruction gathers pace. Increased national savings would be an important part of reducing external debt and will depend in part on whether the recent increase in the household savings rate represents a structural break from the past. Fiscal deficit reduction will also contribute to national savings. The authorities' efforts to identify ways of further increasing national savings are welcome. So that's seeing the debt and the balance of payments deficit as a savings efficiency story. So I set up this as a little IQ test. How many would think that the correct answer to that is 1A, or how many would think the IMF or Treasurer of the Reserve Bank would think it was 1A? I've put you all on your guard, haven't I? Another possible answer is 1B, and I argue that the correct answer is neither. They're an identity, they're two sides of the same coin, one can't explain the other. And in fact, the thing has been in deficit since the mid-1980s because the deficit on net investment income has been about 5% of GDP. That's as high it is because the NIIP, the net international debt, is so high. So causation these days is more running from the level of debt to the current account deficit than the other direction. The final message which the public of New Zealand seems to be told is the fourth one. Well, who cares? The important thing is that people save more. And I think that's rather paradoxical too, because people have also been told that, that it's bad, it's causing a recession, that households aren't spending enough, and every time a survey of opinion shows that households are more willing to spend, that's treated as a good thing. And then households are also told that government has to keep its spending high, because otherwise there's the deficiency of demand because households aren't spending enough. So I think households have been told that whatever they do, it's wrong. So myths about the NIIP, this is coming towards the end. It's the front piece of the paper I tacked on at the end, having done all the data. Investment chronically exceeds savings. As the cause of the negative net international investment position. I've just dealt with the first one. The second one you'll sometimes or too often see written is that we've got all this debt because we spend more than we produce. Well, the test of that is whether exports are greater than imports. And for 20 of the last 25 years, exports have exceeded imports. The exception is after 2004, when the government increased its own spending by 5% of GDP, and then it turned itself around. Another one is, that New Zealanders are lousy savers. We're spending more than we earn. Well, that's not so in aggregate. National savings have been positive for 38 of the last 41 years. A fourth one is that it's the private sector that's to blame. Government net international indebtedness is close enough to zero, and that's true. But when you look at the history of it, the government ran up its net externally domiciled public debt extensively during that period when it was borrowing overseas to finance its own deficits. And since then, it ran large fiscal surpluses, which it used to repay that debt. Well, that's just transferring the problem to taxpayers, because it's their savings being used to pay the taxes or their income, and also privatisation, where the proceeds of that were used to repay government debt. So it just looked as if it had all become private debt. Last one is you'll often see that we've been incurring all this overseas debt because New Zealanders got a love affair with housing, and they've been chasing up house prices, and the borrowing overseas is necessary to fund that. Well, that's mathematically impossible in terms of transactions in the existing stock of houses. You buy a house for $100,000, you sell it to me for $200,000. It's just a transfer of title of cash from my bank account to yours. Might be a mortgage loan on the way, but the bank lends me the mortgage money, I give it to you for your $200,000, you deposit it back. The only thing which can change the net international investment position is something which changes investment relative to savings. The change of title to an existing asset can't do that. So the banks have actually been borrowing. When you look at their balance sheet, you see that they've been increasing their net borrowing overseas, and they've been making net lending to housing because house prices have been going up so much. But that's what's causing people to think that it's the borrowing and housing which has caused the net borrowing overseas. But it's not that at all. The net borrowing overseas has had to happen whether house prices were going up or down, or whether anyone was selling houses or not. It had to happen because the current account was in deficit. So if it hadn't been appearing in the bank's balance sheets that way, it would have been appearing in someone else's balance sheet some other way. Some foreign direct investment myths. The media is giving a lot of attention to this one. Asians are taking over New Zealand. ASEAN countries only account for 3.2% of the inwards foreign direct investment. That excludes Japan, which is 2.9%. It excludes China, and we don't know what that is. It's not in the Stats New Zealand table, and the table doesn't show anything less than 0.6% of the total, so I suspect that's why it's not there. New Zealand is open to takeover is another claim, but it's only one way. We let anyone invest here, but they won't let us invest in their country. That's just not so. England is the country most phenomenally open to foreign direct investment compared to us and virtually every other country. We rank right towards the bottom of the OECD. There's scope for debate about that. We rank at the bottom because we've got extraordinarily comprehensive screening arrangements which cause paperwork, and it raises costs. It's a matter of debate about how much of an effect that has, and I don't have information or an answer to that. I just observe it. Greenfield FDI is better than brownfield, direct investment's better than portfolio. The answer is that there is some evidence for that in terms of spillover benefits, but it's a false choice. They're both good for us to the extent that it's convenient for people to do that, so we should be open to both. New Zealand is becoming tenants in our own country. Well, it's a scare tactic. I've covered that one. What about the future then? Well, it is, openness is scary. Things can happen. We do have a lot of debt. What does an economist say? Well, my wife said this one, you're an economist, you've got to say, it depends, got you. Never give a straight answer. The analysis is, it's come back to two things, and you'll see it's not savings, but they are there indirectly, investments there indirectly. Firstly, the balance between exports and imports, competitiveness. That has to be watched. If government expands and diverts spending to the non-traded goods sector, and with the expansion, the rebuild of Christchurch, that's going to have to happen. There's going to be diversion, and has been diversion of resources to housing. That potentially comes out of your traded goods sector. So we've got to be alert to other things that could be done to reduce costs relative to productivity in that sector. And then the other one I've already covered, just the sheer importance of having a growth rate in incomes which exceed the earnings rate on debt. I show that from 2000 to 2012, the rate we were of earnings, the earnings rate we were paying on the debt exceeded our growth rate. 8% of GDP for the first, 5% for the second, and that alone could have taken that debt ratio from 72% of GDP to over 100%. And we had some fortuitous and favourable factors, particularly the Christchurch earthquake, which meant that suddenly overseas insurers put 15 billion of assets onto our balance sheet. That had a significant thing in their favourable valuation effect. So I think there's absolutely no grounds for complacency at all about the way that ratio could evolve if we don't get both those things right. So there we are, that sums it up. The past is a given. That's how we cope with it today, which is what counts. You can blame the voters if we like, but you never find a voter who said he voted for Muldoon anyway. It's an old Wellington joke from the Times. The debt servicing cost 5% of GDP. That's the real thing that's killing us in terms of current account deficits. The debt doesn't look like it's unsophisticated borrowers and lenders, so that's a point of comfort. And the future focus I've done. And that last slide there is just because it's abstract for most people who are not economists, that there could be a link between government spending and what's going on in the industries trying to compete with imports and to export. That tradables production is Statistics New Zealand's and the Reserve Bank's best measure of how much of our producers are exposed to international competition, and that proportion of GDP is the red line, and you see how it slumped as the share of government spending in the economy went up. So that's the presentation. Thank you very much for listening to me, and delighted to take any questions now. Who would like to